Good evening. We're so glad that you've joined us tonight. I'm Kristen. If I haven't met you, Kristen, previously known as Jackson, now Kristen Ainsworth. Thank you. Been married for 8 weeks, I think. 7, maybe 7. So, yeah. So, anyway, great to be with you guys. So, tonight we are going to talk about this. What keeps you from being fully present in the moment to be a help, a guide, a priest to fellow believers in your group? The purpose of this training is to help each of us best discern and confront what's going on in our own hearts and minds that keeps us from being effective as leaders who are non-anxious, present with the people in front of us, considering one another above ourselves, and leading fellow believers to growth and biblical community. As leaders, it feels really good when we know what to do, doesn't it? When someone in your group who you lead comes to you and asks you a question or seeks your advice, needs counsel from you, and you know exactly what to say, or you know how to guide them, how to direct them, it feels really good. We want to be able at the end of the day to say, yeah, I felt really confident in that space and knew what to do. I nailed it. But what happens when we have opportunities to help people in our group? They come to us wanting us to solve a problem or provide a solution, answer a question, and we have no idea what to tell them. That doesn't feel very good, does it? I remember one of my first situations like this when I came on staff at the village. There was a crisis care situation with a couple who had been married and had just a really difficult, dysfunctional marriage for a decade. They'd met with pastors, elders, they'd been in a strong home group, and their home group leaders and members had helped. And I was kind of handed over primary care with this situation. And so this is ongoing, long-term difficulty. And so I step in, I'm brand new, and we had a staff gathering one night, and one of the pastor's wives, who I'd never met before, came up to me and said, hey, I was on the phone earlier today with this woman, the wife of this couple. I knew that they were in close relationship, and so this pastor's wife said, this woman told me all these things that were happening today, and everything is panicky and frantic, and here's what she said. What do I tell her? And I had no idea. I had no idea what to say in that moment. I had no idea how to direct her. What I did know was that what was flaring inside of me was anxiety. I thought, in this moment, I have to know the exact right thing to say, have the perfect answer, so that this woman standing in front of me and her husband, who's like somewhere up the chain my boss, I want them to think that I am awesome, right? I'm wise, I'm helpful, I know exactly what to say to solve this 10-year problem of a marriage. And ultimately, I had no idea what to say. And I was so focused in that moment on what was flaring inside of me, my shadow side that's perfectionistic and seeking approval of this person in front of me, that I just could not be helpful in that situation. So I was very aware in that moment that a huge gap existed, a gap between, in this moment, I've got to do something, I have to say something, and I have no idea what that should be. So the book that we're going to tell you about tonight is called Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs, by Steve Cuss. So we're going to take you through an overview of this book because our team has found it to be incredibly helpful, and we think that it'll be really helpful for you. And so instead of having to read the whole thing, we thought we'll give you some highlights that would be effective and practical for you to use now. So Cuss defines leadership as knowing what to do. He says that when people don't know what to do, they look to you and expect you, the leader, to know what to do. But there's times when we have no idea what to do, and yet we have to do something. And this is what he calls the gap. So leadership is knowing what to do. That's his quick definition. I would summarize the main idea of this book to be, in order to be present to help the people in front of us, we have to be aware of what's going on inside of us. We must attend to our own anxiety if we have any hope of becoming the type of leader that our people need us to be. And the way this starts is developing the capacity to mind the gap. The gap always exists. There's always going to be moments when we have no idea what to do, and yet people are depending on us to do something. And what we do in that space, in that gap, is what he refers to as minding the gap. And that's kind of where we're going to focus tonight. So Cuss would say, like, leadership is vulnerable. It always exposes a leader's blind spots and their shadow side. If you're not familiar with this term shadow side, it's like, think of the things that are God's gifts to you, things that are specific to you and how you're created and how you're wired. But there's kind of this dark back edge to most of those things. So if you're wired to achieve and to do things with excellence, there's this dark back side of it, a shadow side of perfectionism and seeking approval, things like that would be when our flesh is flaring, our sinful compulsions that exist. That's what he would call our shadow side. And for leaders, there will always be the pressure that exposes this gap that exists, because we simply can't know what to do and say in every situation, can we? And so it's hard when people expect that from us, and then we expect that from ourselves. But the good news is that there's hope in all of this. So there's hope for us to grow as leaders in our awareness of what's bubbling under the surface in our own hearts and minds, in a way that enables us to be more present with the people that we lead, so that we can clearly think through what to say and how to help them. If we're always thinking about managing what we're feeling, those compulsions inside of us, we can't be present with the people in front of us who need us. So anxiety presents this false gospel, and it's the gospel of self-reliance. And the gospel of self-reliance is always bad news, because it always produces more anxiety, as opposed to the good news of Christ and his grace that brings freedom. So anxiety bubbling under the surface in us demands our attention, which means it's simultaneously blocking our ability to be aware of God's presence and serve the person in front of us who needs us. So it's always demanding our attention, that anxiety inside of us, and it's preaching the gospel of self-reliance. But the good news is, if we can learn to notice it and name it and then move past it, we can actually encounter the true gospel, the gospel of grace that leads to freedom. So leadership anxiety is generated by something in particular. It's fueled by what we think we need in that moment to be okay. So think about it this way. If you imagine a situation in which you as a leader have someone in front of you who needs your help, and they come to you and they ask you what to do, and you're aware in that moment that you don't know what to do, there's something inside of you that you think you need to be okay. So if you think back on a time, maybe one comes quickly to your mind and maybe not. But if you have a time that comes to mind where you could think of a time that someone needed something from you, they were coming to you expecting you to help or solve a problem, and you started feeling anxiety in that moment, what was it you thought you actually needed to be okay? There's always something in that moment that exists, that's something other than Christ that we feel like we need in order to be okay. And that is what generates this anxiety in leaders. So in the story I shared earlier, when I was feeling that anxiety standing in front of this pastor's wife who's asking me for help, and I knew in that moment that I did not have any idea what to say, what I was primarily feeling was this compulsion, this need for approval of the person in front of me. So at that moment, I am not primarily concerned with this couple who's in crisis, because I can't even put my attention onto them. This anxiety in me is demanding my attention. I can't even think clearly. So there's no shot at me being helpful in that moment, or even knowing how to begin to help. And so what's primarily going on is this need for approval and need for affirmation, and this perfectionism in me flaring. And I didn't have the tools or the language to name it at that point. I had no idea what was going on. It was kind of my first situation like that. And what's interesting, too, about anxiety is in those moments, generally our physical body is responding in a particular way, like a racing heart, racing thoughts. So we have this physical response that happens when that anxiety is bubbling inside of us under the surface, and it's showing me this false gospel of self-reliance is in full swing. That's what my physical body is an indicator of in that moment. And so how interesting is it that God has wired us and designed our physical bodies to be this gift of like an indicator light? If you think of like an indicator light on your dashboard showing you something is off. It's this marker, like an early detection system that says, hey, guess what? Right now, you think you need something other than Jesus to be okay. Something is majorly off inside of you because you are being fueled by the shadow side, this false gospel of self-reliance, and there's something you think you need to be okay. But the good news of the true gospel is that Jesus died so that I don't have to need the approval of people anymore. Christ died to set me free from the fear of man, approval seeking, perfectionism. He died so that I can be free from that. And so in that moment, when we can think about what do I think I need right now to be okay, and we recognize it and name it, then we can give it to the Lord. We can confess and express to him what's going on inside of us in such a way that we can be freed from it. So then I can be present with the person in front of me who needs my help. So as we notice our anxiety and prayerfully consider and name its source, we can then rest free in our identity in Christ and freedom from whatever that thing is that our flesh was telling us that we needed, that we don't actually need. So I'll share one quick quote with you from the book. Cuss says, anxiety exacts a toll and bolsters self, but noticing it and naming it allows us to be others focused. So the freedom comes when we recognize it, we name it, and then we can say, Christ died to set me free from this. He has overpowered this thing that has had power over me in that moment, feeling like I'm overpowered by this need for approval. What's true is that Christ has overpowered that already. So here in just a few minutes, you're going to hear from Jared and Justin about some specific sources of anxiety. And this is going to help you identify what those sources are in the future. But first, I want to give you a few minutes. We're going to do a lot of reflection time tonight. So you're going to have a lot of time to hear information and then take some time to really prayerfully reflect on it. So the first thing I want you to do is take a few minutes to process all this that I've just shared. The gap that exists for all leaders, the pressure of knowing that you need to do something but have no idea what to do, and what you do in that moment and that gap, minding the gap there. The awareness of the false gospel of self-reliance and the feeling like we need something other than Jesus to be okay in a moment. To think about that in your own experience, in your own life. Maybe it's work situations, maybe it's family situations, not necessarily just as group leaders, but certainly that's going to be a common occurrence, I would imagine, for most group leaders. So I want you to take a minute to prayerfully consider what you think you need apart from Christ to be okay. And then think about how you could complete this sentence. Jesus died to free me from needing blank anymore. So take a few minutes to think about that, and then we'll come back up. So take a few minutes to consider how this information is personally applicable or relevant. Are there patterns or behaviors in your life that show evidence of leadership anxiety? And then after you've taken a few minutes, maybe